Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second OpenMinds Speaker Series webinar. In the spirit of high efficiency and impact, we're going to get started as close to on time as we can. Welcome. We are OpenMinds, a nonprofit focused on one of the most defining challenges of our time, meeting the dual challenge that we need more energy, less emissions, and fast. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. A few housekeeping items from me. This session is going to end at 10:15 Central, and so we are 45 minutes long. We will have Q&A, and so there is a Q&A box that you can see in the toolbar of Zoom. If you use that to send your questions, we will get to questions after about 30 minutes. That will be the time for Q&A, but you can submit them at any time. Once we switch over to questions, I'll read the questions out loud, and our guest Jason will answer them. This session is recorded, and it will be shared after the call. It will be shared on YouTube and on LinkedIn. So you can follow up and watch it again if you're interested. And while there is no audio and video for anyone outside of the participants, so please know you can just sit back and enjoy. And now I'd like to hand things over to our Executive Director, David Baldwin, who will get us started.
Hey, thank you, Will, and thanks to the entire Open Minds Network for joining us today. To help frame this discussion, we're honored to be joined by Jason Wells, who's the Chairman, President, and CEO of CenterPoint Energy. Fortunately, our fantastic utility here in Houston, Texas. Jason has a really unique background, serving as a senior officer at both PG&E in California and now leading our effort at CenterPoint based here in Houston. So he's seen a lot of extreme weather events, demand growth, regulatory complexity, and we're really fortunate to have him with us today. This is really a lead-in to our work at OM26 at Stanford on April 14th and 15th, where Open Minds will be convening over 100 utility and grid experts to advance our Grid Vision Impact Project, essentially how to most affordably and strategically electrify America for a strong electricity future. Grid Vision focuses on strengthening and expanding the U.S. power grid to meet rapid load growth while improving connectivity, reliability, affordability, and long-term emissions reduction. So let's get started, Jason. Thanks so much for being here. And I might start just by asking you a little bit about your background, both at PG&E and now at CenterPoint.
Well, thanks, David, for having me. Look, I've spent my entire career in and around the utility industry. I started auditing and consulting with utilities in the Southeast. I spent about 14 years at PG&E out in San Francisco, the last 5 out there as the company's CFO. And then for about the last 5 years now, I've been at CenterPoint, a utility that serves about 7 million customers and 4 different states. I started here as CFO. I spent a year as COO, and the last 2 now as CEO of CenterPoint.
Fantastic. CenterPoint and you have navigated some major reliability challenges when you arrived, Jason, including Winter Storm Uri in February of 21, and then Hurricane Beryl in June of 24. And you personally have great experience in 2 very different environments with Texas and California, and I know you're in other markets also. But what did those experiences teach you about building a grid that can withstand increasingly extreme weather?
You know, spending my entire career in and around the industry, I've seen the best the industry has to offer in enabling everyday life and the pursuit of possibility through economic growth. At the same time, to the point that you raised, David, I've seen the very tragic consequences of the impact of severe weather, catastrophic asset failures, both, as you said here at CenterPoint and PG&E. Those incidents have profoundly shaped me, not just as a professional, but as a person. And when I think about the application to the grid, I'm entirely convinced it first starts with culture. Historically, utilities have been very reactive in nature. So much so that just even a few years ago, we would see bumps in customer satisfaction when we were responding to storms, which would reinforce the notion that we should react to an event as opposed to prevent an outage from occurring, prevent that event from occurring. And so it's fundamentally reshaping, again, the culture to be more proactive as opposed to reactive. I think additionally, the industry has been behind in terms of leveraging technology to get the most risk reduction for every dollar spent. And I'm convinced that that's the path forward. I think historically the industry's really relied on visual inspections of its assets. I believe strongly that grid operators need to understand with a rigorous level of detail the condition of their assets using drones, high definition cameras, thermal imagery, satellite imagery, LiDAR, sensors on the equipment. We've built a digital twin where we can then test how our grid will stand up to different conditions, understanding then where we make the design changes that help prevent these catastrophic asset failures and or severe impacts from weather. Things like burying our electric lines where they could cause a fire or where they pose, trees pose fall-in risk, causing extended outages. Also things like putting more self-healing technology, grids that will restore power without manual intervention, intelligent grid switching devices that allow us to reroute automatically power to other customers and really isolate that outage to the smallest impact. And so it really comes, again, starting first with the culture, getting the organization to orient around preventing these things from occurring as opposed to reacting to them, utilizing technology to be very targeted, and then redesigning a grid that has been around for 100 years.
Jason, you talk about a change in culture, even driving that before all the implementation of new technology to prevent outages. But one thing I noticed when you became CEO is my phone started telling me, how healthy my grid was at every section. What's the role of communications, and how have you implemented that, and what have been the results at CenterPoint?
Yeah, no one tells the story better than the company, and unfortunately, what we experienced in Hurricane Beryl is a couple of years ago, we did not communicate effectively with our customers. We did not let them know the conditions they should expect, the length of the outage, and understandably, our community was incredibly frustrated. We made a commitment to our customers that we would never under communicate again. And I think part of rebuilding trust is delivering on a say-do ratio of 1. We laid out an ambitious plan to invest in our grid. We communicate with our customers about those investments. We let them know when we're going into their neighborhood that they can expect a planned outage to make these reliability and resiliency investments. We communicate the day of, we communicate afterwards, and it really starts to reflect this proactive nature of an investment in the grid. I'm super proud, over the course of the last year, we saved our customers 100 million outage minutes year over year on a weather adjusted basis, which averages about 35 minutes per household or business here in the Houston region. And the exciting thing is we're just getting started with some of this resiliency work.
Jason, many of us are familiar with sort of how the general economic model works for utilities, but you normally don't get rewarded for doing things that make your grid more resilient or more efficient. But how did you all justify the investments in grid hardening and reliability when a lot of the market models don't necessarily incentivize that?
I try to simplify our business model in one where if we have happy customers, we generally will have happy regulators and legislators. And if we have happy regulators and legislators, generally the financial model works for our investors who fund these investments. But it starts first with that customer experience. But for us, I also think when we look back at like the cost of not making these investments on a societal basis, it's pretty profound. The GDP of the greater Houston region is approaching $2 billion a day. Every day that we're without power here, from a severe weather event is really costing not just our local economy, I'd argue kind of the, broader Texas national and in some cases the global economy, just given the importance of the petrochemical complex that we've got in our backyard. And so making these investments with an eye towards the economic activity that it's supporting, I think helps rationalize these investments. The other thing that we have is, Houston's been growing exponentially for years. And so as we socialize these fixed costs over an ever widening and increasing customer base, we've been able to keep our rates flat for our customers since 2014.
Wow.
Despite significantly investing in improved outcomes.
That's awesome. That's awesome, Jason. Before we leave this whole reliability question, what are your models and what does your crystal ball say about the frequency of challenging weather events? Our mission at OpenMinds is both keeping energy affordable and available, but also the longer term impacts of climate change. But do you anticipate more weather events, or is that something that you really model?
We do. We've got in-house meteorology. As I mentioned, we've got a digital twin of our system. We're constantly trying to predict what we'll be up against. I find it interesting here in Harris County, which is the primary county for the greater Houston region. It is ranked as the county most susceptible to severe weather risk of any county in the U.S. By a factor of 25% more than the next county, which would be in Florida. And that's really a factor. We basically are presented with almost every weather risk other than earthquakes. And so as we look to prepare for our grid, I think obviously the weather is becoming more severe, but more importantly, I think we're seeing sort of the density of investment in cities that creates a higher cost to these events when they occur, right? And I think that's largely where we orient our models. Where is there going to be the most sizable impact, and how do we get in front of that risk in a very targeted, meaningful way?
So I didn't think there was a tougher environmental job than being an executive at PG&E, but you just told me that maybe running CenterPoint is challenging or maybe more challenging. Don't tell my realtor that, please. But that's awesome. Great training ground. You mentioned the growth that we're seeing now in electricity demand and a spectacular record of not having rate increases for 12 years. That's got to be top decile in the U.S. But what are you seeing in demand growth from data centers and other sources in your market area, in the Houston area? And how do you keep energy prices steady like you've been able to do?
Yeah, it's just incredibly exciting time that we haven't seen in our industry since the post-World War II boom years. But here, what we are forecasting a 50% increase in peak demand by 2029. So think about this: a grid that we've taken over 100 years to build will increase it by 50% within this decade, and see a path to doubling it before the middle of next. So within the next 10 years, and it's pretty extraordinary. It's across the board. Houston's got a ton of investment in life sciences. We've got advanced manufacturing. Clearly, the oil and gas industry is an anchor for this industrial growth. We're also seeing data center activity. At the end of the day, I think that this load growth is the path to affordability. There's a lot of misinformation out there. At a time when nationally you look at utility rates rising, it's about the same time we've started to, as a country, talk about the need for data centers. Unfortunately, I think it's correlation without causation. I think a lot of the rising utility rates have really been the implementation of policy that have been 10 years in the making, retiring old generation facilities that have largely been paid for and bringing on new generating assets. I don't really think we're seeing yet, at least on a kind of a macro basis, cost increases from data centers, even though that is what is often reported in the news. For us, what we've seen, and one of the clear paths to keeping those affordable rates, is we've been growing the system here, and again, that allows us to share the fixed costs over an ever widening base, keeping those energy costs flat for the 12 years. And so our path forward is to continue to enable this economic growth in all of these industries. And I think it is we'll continue to keep our rates affordable as we connect these new large loads.
So growth can be your friend from a rate perspective if you do it smartly and strategically. It sounds like it. And I'll ask a bit of a controversial question now, but what's the role of renewables and clean energy sources and sort of that balance of growth and needing it now versus also needing to keep rates low as well? How do renewables fit into the stack, if you will?
I think that's what's really enabled this incredible Texas economic miracle. We at CenterPoint, we're basically the wires business, so we're not in the generation side. But clearly, we've got a match. We're supplying or matching demand to the supply side with our wires. As we look at the supply side, it has been incredible. We've as a state connected about 45 gigawatts of new installed generation, largely solar and batteries over the last 5 years. To put that in context, that's just slightly smaller than the peak demand on the entire California grid. We've built that as a state in 5 years because we could move at pace and at scale in an affordable way with solar and batteries. And what we've seen is the grid has really held up. We almost hit a record peak on the Texas grid last summer, and prices remained modest on an energy standpoint that entire day in the mid $30 a megawatt hour. And I think that's, again, a reflection of the fact, how powerful the combination of this incremental solar and battery combination on our grid, how powerful it can be.
That's awesome, Jason. Well, I'm going to pivot a little bit to our grid vision work that we'll be sharing at Stanford in a few weeks. And you've been a great coach, and CenterPoint's been a great partner on this. But we've really split that plan into two phases: optimizing the grid we currently have while also building the future grid that we need with more lines and more wires and more pipes, et cetera. But where do you see the biggest challenges ahead across the U.S. to meet load growth? What are the bottlenecks, and how do we need to get over those bottlenecks?
Look, I think it's just moving at the pace of business, right? As I mentioned, it's taken us about 100 years to build this grid, and we'll double it within 10. Culturally, we haven't been oriented around moving fast. Oftentimes in construction, they talk about measure twice, cut once. I think for utilities, it's, the equivalent would be measure 4 times and cut once. We're really a risk-averse, industry, understandably so, because of the importance of what we provide communities. But making sure that we have a team that sort of approaches this large load growth from a commercial and customer orientation. These large loads, they can connect anywhere. So we're competing to attract them to Houston in this example. That means we have to move at the speed at which they want to move their business, right? We've got to be able to have access to the materials, the partnership to flex our labor, to build that construction. Fortunately, we've got those in place, which is why I think we've been having a track record of enabling large load growth for decades here in Houston. I think, back to your question, I think those areas in the country that have historically not been growing are going to be more challenged with supply chain slots. They're going to be more challenged in trying to find just-in-time labor to come and address a unique project as opposed to a portfolio of projects. And I think it's, again, an advantage being in Houston, where we have seen this growth year after year for decades.
That's great. Well, speaking of growth, I want to pivot. You recently toured China's electricity system with a group of other folks from OpenMinds as well, very distinguished group that went over there. And what were your takeaways, both from the Chinese grid and then the implications back to us back home in the U.S.?
Yeah, it was an incredibly fascinating experience. We were having the debate here: is China the first electric superpower? And we got the idea, well, why don't we go see it firsthand? So we visited 4 different cities in China, looking at it from the lens of suppliers to producers to consumers of electricity. And, walking away, I think China's probably the first modern electric superpower. As I've reflected on that trip, it is incredible the capacity they've built in a short period of time with sort of a national policy orientation to that build. But I do reflect on how much our country built post-World War II boom years, where we commercialized nuclear reactors, we modernized hydro systems, we built a grid that sustained kind of that manufacturing and industrial base. So I would argue we did it first, but China is now a modern electric superpower that we need to take away from. And I think that national policy orientation, I think, has been an advantage. Maybe a couple of other points. I was surprised at the level of excess capacity, and I think that can cut both ways. We would tour electric vehicle manufacturing facilities, state of the art, advanced manufacturing, unbelievable facilities. But there'd be 5 buildings next to it that would be completely empty. Same thing, solar manufacturing, residential buildings. That can either be an incredible tailwind if they can economically find a way to fill that capacity, or it can be a huge headwind, for their economy. And I'm still sort of reflecting on, which direction I think it'll head after that trip. And the other thing that I would say is, from an innovation standpoint, I think we still have in our country a very unique system that rewards risk, venture capital, financially, legally, culturally. And I think that allows us to really innovate, probably at a pace that I didn't necessarily see over there. Now, I think the difference is what we saw was when there was an innovation that needed to be scaled, I think China scales it at a pace faster than the U.S., just given their, again, national policy orientation and their, focus over the last several decades on manufacturing capacity. But just an incredibly fascinating trip. Bringing it back to us, I think the more that we can have a national policy focus, I think the more we'll be able to compete on keeping our grid growing at the pace that we need to support industry. And I would say that Texas reflects that. Our governor here, Governor Abbott, often says that the state needs to move at the pace of business. That translates into the work the legislature does, the state agencies. We've shortened transmission planning windows. We've adopted a higher voltage standard for transmission design. These are the tools that will help us advance the grid faster. It really shows that when there is sort of, top to bottom alignment in a clear objective of, growing a grid to support this economic development, it can happen at scale and at pace, needed to compete worldwide.
Well, Jason, you mentioned having a plan, and I think you're spot on that Texas has had a plan and has been pretty bold about connecting some new low-cost loads into our system that have kept us very affordable and kept up with demand. One of the things at OpenMinds, we've tried to learn from CenterPoint, learn from ERCOT, learn from Texas, and then create a plan for the country. And we've been doing that with our 50 or 60 utility partners and grid experts across the country, but also interfacing with the federal government on that too, to get their feedback as we go. But have you seen a good, credible plan for the country to optimize this demand growth and to build something that's strategic for our future? Or are we trying to do something that might be additive to the conversation and to our progress?
I think it's additive. I think it's needed. I think that there are a lot of new companies trying to solve these challenges. But I think it's there's many dimensions to this. And the more that OpenMinds can help orient around kind of a national direction, I think the better off we'll be. I mean, I think this idea of getting more out of the capacity that we have, right? Creating more connectivity in our regions with transmission, right? Doing more kind of on the demand management side. I think that it's very doable with a cohesive strategy, and I really applaud Open Minds for the work they're doing to try to bring that all together.
You just read our plan, but you sort of wrote our plan also, so that's not surprising to me. But before we open it up to audience questions, I'm going to ask one more question. As we continue to electrify greater portions of our economy in the U.S., what excites you the most about that? Where are we really on the right track? And then what concerns you the most about doing that smartly and cost effectively?
I just love the level of innovation that's occurring across the full industry, right? Some of the advanced work that's happening, geothermal, I believe strongly that nuclear has a place in our energy supply. I think that the really creative work, on the demand side, one of the Open Minds participants, Carrier, proposing batteries in their HVAC equipment, right? Could be a huge unlock. I think for them, close to 100 gigawatts of potential peak demand shift, right? I think the level of innovation is what creates a ton of optimism and excitement for me. I think the other side of it is I think we still need to invest as a country more in our manufacturing capacity. Some of the equipment that will slow this growth down is high voltage circuit breakers, high voltage transformers, high voltage DC lines. We just haven't invested at the scale necessary for the equipment that is going to be needed to move at pace. So that's probably what has me, always up at night and a little bit cautious. But I think the flip side to it, the level of investment, creativity, innovation that's occurring, I think we will find new unlocks that we hadn't thought about before, and I'm excited about what that means for our industry.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jason. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Will, and Will, audience questions.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, David. As a reminder, there's a Q&A box along the bottom tab of your Zoom window. If you want to click on that, type in your question. We will get to as many questions as we can in the next 15 minutes. Our first question is, what is the strategy for adding power to meet market demand?
For us, I would say that we're fairly unique in the fact that we actually have excess capacity today. So we have nearly 10 gigawatts of excess capacity on our system. We're working with our market, ERCOT, to allocate that capacity efficiently. At the same time, we are thinking about replacing it and rebuilding it. And so I mentioned, one of the things that I think was incredibly thoughtful. The state of Texas passed legislation adopting a new voltage standard for our electric transmission lines, 765 kV. We'll build more 765 kV lines in Texas than exist across the US in about the next 7 years. And that is going to unlock exponentially more capacity. So as we look at what we have today and we're allocating that 10 gigs right about the time that we are out of that excess capacity, we'll be connecting those new transmission lines that will replace, the capacity to continue to grow. And I think it's really having kind of that, 5, 10, 15-year plan in place where we're in front of that electric load growth, that electric demand. We're not having to build just in time. We're building to connect to existing capacity. I think that has been a strategic advantage for the greater Houston region. I think there are other areas in the country that are capacity constrained, and that is going to be a much more difficult proposition to connect large loads at pace.
Yeah, and Jason, I hadn't thought about it in that context, but it really is a strong visual that if you were already growing at 3% and the rest of the country wasn't growing, then for you to go to 8%, that body in motion can accelerate. So that's really left a strong visual on me. So what is your average load growth year over year now on your system?
So, last year we saw energy sales roughly growing at about 7%. So I do predict energy is going to outpace peak demand because I think there's going to be more work done on managing the demand side of the business, more flexible uh, load, whether that's data centers, industrial customers being more sensitive to price signals. But energy price, energy uh, sales increased about 7% last year.
Got it.
Okay, our next question. What assumption about reliability or grid operations do you think utilities may need to rethink as demand and climate or weather pressures increase?
Yeah, I think there's an entire sort of reorientation around a customer's expectation around reliability and grid resiliency. As I said, even just a few years ago, we would see bumps in customer satisfaction as we responded to storms. Customers like to see our crews out in their neighborhoods. They felt like they were getting something for their dollar. But now, in this connected world that we live in, people working from home, always on devices, people don't want to experience any outage. And so I think it's flipping again this orientation to how do we prevent it? How do we move to much more of a preventative maintenance model? How do we create kind of again this self-healing grid? Here in Houston Electric, to kind of bring this to life, I was very fortunate to inherit a system where most of the transmission has been built to an extreme wind standard. So we never saw any outages associated with the transmission system in several of these severe weather events. We also have about 50% of our grid that's underground, which is an incredibly high percentage. Where we were behind, though, is Houston's got the densest vegetation of any city, any coastal city in the U.S. And our vegetation management program wasn't world class. We had a 5-year trim cycle. We've now moved it to 3-year. More importantly, we're using AI to predict growth. We're using satellite imagery to understand chlorophyll and tree health, right? We're going out and tackling on a risk basis outside of that 3-year trim cycle, those trees that present the most risk. Equally, the system was behind in the level of automation. We didn't have these smart reclosers. Basically, a lot of outages on an electric system are transient. Maybe a branch hits a line. The outage is created to protect the equipment, but there's nothing structurally wrong. There are switches now that automatically would close and re-energize, avoiding, kind of sending out crews to do any repairs. That type of work, attacking the veg and the automation, has really led us to just what are profound changes in our reliability performance in a very short period of time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And if there's one thing I take from this webinar, it's attacking the veg as an important grid resilience effort. That's awesome. I'm from North Carolina, so I can relate. Land of the pine, lots of trees.
Yep.
Our next question: what are the innovations we need, irrespective of national policy? Policy-proof, no regrets innovations.
I really think it's on the demand side more than anything. The stat that I often lean on is we have roughly 1.3 terawatts of installed generation capacity in our peak, so a little north of 750 gigawatts. It's not necessarily where we want it or when we want it, but if we could shift that demand, we can unlock a tremendous amount of embedded efficiency in the existing system. So I think the work that's being done kind of on that demand side is hugely valuable, particularly at a time where, this large load growth is here now. It's not predicted 3, 5, 7, 10 years. It's here today. I think, unlocking innovation on the demand side is important. Equally, as I said, getting more out of the assets that we have, either reconductoring our existing transmission lines, using dynamic line rating to kind of enhance capacity. I think all of those tools are relevant, but I really think sort of shifting this demand just even slightly unlocks extraordinary capacity that can serve the energy needs that are here today.
Hmm. A question for me here, Jason. If you had to select one recent win for CenterPoint that you'd like to share, or that really comes to mind for you, but then also balance that with one worry as you look ahead? What's your win and worry right now?
Oh, I'm privileged to work with a great team here. It's hard to pick, but I think the improvement that we've had in our reliability since the frustration we caused our communities with Hurricane Beryl. I think it's been a tremendous amount of work in our system where we're actually seeing the results, the improvement in reliability that I spoke of. My worry is really just kind of continuing to keep pace with the growth. I think we've done a number of things to address that. For instance, as I was thinking about who culturally from a COO should lead this company, I brought in somebody from one of the large engineering and construction companies, has more of a commercial mindset, moves at the pace of business, used to building large infrastructure projects. And he has helped sort of transform this notion of, again, working under a customer's timeline, not our timeline, moving at the pace of business. I think, that has been a cultural unlock, being ahead of a lot of the industry in terms of securing production slots for manufacturing equipment. We've taken steps to de-risk it, but it really is at the end of the day, continuing to move at the speed of business. Our customers, these large loads, they have choice. If we don't move at their pace, they will build their business somewhere else. And, I worry about, the opportunity of losing the right to serve those loads.
Question here coming in. Jason, the large load growth in the CenterPoint area is more oriented towards industrial facilities vis-a-vis data centers. How does this impact your planning compared to the planning that ERCOT is doing statewide?
We work hand in glove with ERCOT. When ERCOT passed, when the state legislature passed the new transmission voltage standard, it was really oriented at the oil and gas industry. There's a lot of demand in the Permian Basin to electrify the drilling and fracking out there. But energy moves east in Texas. All of that drilling basically is refined and processed in Houston. The state understood that we needed it while they were creating this new voltage standard for West Texas. They needed to make sure that it supported East Texas. That was working then, as I said, hand in glove with ERCOT to make sure that we had that capacity available as the demand for electricity increases here. For us, we're constantly working with ERCOT, looking at how power flows, which is changing pretty dramatically. When our large load growth used to be just exclusively oriented to the oil and gas industry, that was basically on the eastern side near the Houston Ship Channel. Right now, as we start to see data centers, we're seeing those kind of on the western side. So it's an entirely different load profile. So not only do we have to import electricity to Houston, we need to move it in different quantities to different geographies within our footprint. So we continue to propose with ERCOT. I think right now we've got roughly 200 projects that we're discussing with them to make sure that we've got that import capacity, and then when we have it here in Houston, that we can move it to where we actually need it in the region.
Question here is, as you're building out additional infrastructure, what kind of vulnerabilities are you concerned about or looking to address when it comes to extreme weather or other extreme events? How are you addressing those as you build out additional capacity?
So for us, we've adopted an extreme wind standard for all of our transmission facilities. So 155 mile an hour winds. On the distribution system, we've got two, sort of a coastal standard that is 155 mile an hour winds, and then an inland standard that's closer to 125. It's really building the equipment that's largely oriented. Our primary risk is going to be extreme wind. We also have to look at, extreme heat, extreme cold, flooding. We've elevated substantially all of our substations that could be prone to flood risk. We had a terrible set of floods in Hurricane Harvey just about a decade ago, and after that, we embarked on a 10-year journey to elevate our substations. So, we're looking at those risks pretty comprehensively today, with the conflict in Iran, really focused on cyber and physical enhancements to our facilities to protect critical infrastructure. So, this job of risk management, it never ends. It's always thinking about the new risk and hardening our assets to accommodate it.
I think as a final question, CERAWeek is here. I'm actually here hiding out on the third floor of the GRB at CERAWeek now. With so many folks from the industry and on both the supply and on the demand side here, if you could have one message for the CERAWeek conference, if I could put you on the keynote stage later today, what would your message be to the energy industry and to the demand side as well?
Look, I think there's a lot of hand wringing around this large growth, and I couldn't be more optimistic about meeting this dual challenge. We will stay in front of this. It's a national imperative. We've got a lot of smart minds thinking about how we will keep pace with this extraordinary growth in electric demand, and I know we're going to do so in a way that minimizes emissions. And so I'm extraordinarily optimistic, despite what many think are challenges. If it was easy, it wouldn't be fun. And it's a really fun time in our industry.
That's great.
Yeah, Jason, I just want to thank you. That was super insightful, super aligned with the work we're doing at Open Minds, and a great primer before we go to Stanford and really start releasing our work on the national grid system. And I think my big takeaway today is you've done an amazing job sort of healing our grid and preparing it for these challenging weather events that will become more frequent. But you've done that at the same time of meeting huge load growth and keeping rates low. So that's almost the trifecta. And if we throw in there emissions reduction on your system over a longer period of time, affordability, reliability, sharpening the focus on long-term strategy and emissions reduction, you're checking all those boxes. So we're super grateful for your leadership at CenterPoint. For those of you joining us today, we hope this conversation sharpens how you think about reliability, resilience, and overall grid system performance. This discussion is directly informing OpenMinds grid vision work, essentially examining how the U.S. can strengthen and expand our power grid to meet the rapid load growth, but while also maintaining reliability and affordability. We look forward to continuing this discussion and conversation with many of you at our big launch of Grid Vision on April 14th and 15th in Stanford, where we'll have many of Jason's peers together helping us shape the future. Jason, thanks again for sharing your insights with the Open Minds Network, and a big thank you to you and the team at CenterPoint for your expertise on Grid Vision. And thanks to all of the folks that joined us today, our Open Minds Network, for your time, leadership, and willingness to engage seriously with one of the most important challenges of our era. So great job, Jason. Thank you so much for your time this morning, and we'll look forward to our next webinar coming after Stanford. So
Thank you, David. Enjoyed it.
Have a great day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.